Have you ever felt a spark with a woman and wondered if she felt it too, but you couldn't quite tell? You replay the moment later in your mind, the conversation, the smile, the way she looked at you, and you start asking yourself a question that many men have asked before you. Was there something there, or was I imagining it? Today, we're going to explore something most people never learn how to see. The quiet signals that reveal when attraction has already begun. Not loud gestures, not dramatic flirting, but subtle behaviors that appear before anything is ever spoken. In fact, the third signal we'll talk about today is so subtle that most men completely miss it, even when it's happening right in front of them. Hello, and welcome back. I'm Mary Smith, and here on the Mindful Senior Living channel, we explore human psychology, relationships, emotional intelligence, and the deeper patterns that shape how people connect with one another. Let me tell you something that surprises many people. A lot of men are actually very good at sensing energy between themselves and someone else. They can feel when a conversation flows easily. They notice when laughter comes naturally. They feel when the atmosphere between two people becomes slightly warmer than usual. But what many men struggle with is interpreting the quiet signals that women often use to express early attraction. And that confusion is completely understandable, because men and women often experience attraction very differently. For many men, attraction feels direct and immediate. You see someone who catches your attention, you feel drawn toward them, and your instinct is to move forward. But for many women, attraction unfolds more slowly, more subtly. It's not a sudden leap forward. It's more like opening small doors, one at a time, and quietly observing who notices them. Women often look for emotional safety before allowing attraction to grow. They watch, they listen, they create moments of connection and observe how someone responds. And during this process, something interesting happens. They rarely announce their interest directly. They whisper it. Those whispers appear in body language, in tone of voice, in eye contact, in small behaviors that might seem ordinary unless you know what to look for. And here's the fascinating part. Once you learn how to recognize these signals, social interactions begin to feel very different. Moments that once felt confusing suddenly start to make sense. Situations that once slipped past your awareness become much clearer. You begin to notice patterns that were always there, but hidden in plain sight. Before we explore these signals, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked back on a moment from years ago and suddenly realized, wait, I think she might have liked me? Maybe it was a coworker who always seemed to find reasons to talk to you. Maybe it was someone at a party who lingered nearby longer than necessary. Maybe it was a woman who laughed at your jokes just a little more than everyone else did. At the time, you brushed it off. You assumed she was simply being friendly. But later, when you replayed the moment in your mind, something about it felt different. If that has ever happened to you, you're not alone. Millions of men have had that exact experience. And the reason isn't that men are unaware or socially incapable. It's simply that most people were never taught how to recognize the language of subtle attraction. So today, we're going to slow things down and look closely at 3 signals that often appear when a woman is beginning to feel genuine interest. These signals are quiet, they are subtle, and that's exactly why they matter. Because attraction rarely begins with fireworks. Most of the time, it begins with curiosity, a small gesture, a lingering glance, a moment where two people become slightly more aware of each other than they are of anyone else around them. And when you learn to notice those moments, something powerful happens. You stop guessing, you stop overthinking, you simply observe what is already happening. So let's begin with the first signal. The first sign that a woman may already feel a spark of attraction is something incredibly simple: touch. But not just any touch. We're talking about those small moments where physical contact happens without a clear practical reason.
Not the accidental brush of hands when passing something across a table. Not the polite handshake you might give someone when meeting them. Something slightly different, more natural, more instinctive. Imagine you're standing in conversation with a woman. You're both laughing about something. The atmosphere is relaxed. As she responds to something you said, she lightly touches your arm for a brief moment. Then her hand lingers just slightly longer than necessary. Not long enough to feel dramatic, just long enough for your mind to notice it. That tiny moment matters more than most people realize, because touch is one of the earliest signals of comfort, and comfort is one of the first foundations of attraction. When someone feels uneasy around another person, their body naturally creates distance. Their movements stay guarded. Their gestures remain contained. But when someone begins to feel curious, interested, emotionally comfortable, those boundaries soften. Physical distance shrinks slightly. Touch begins to appear in small, natural ways. Sometimes it's playful. She might tap your arm while laughing. Sometimes it's casual. She might adjust your collar jokingly or brush something off your sleeve. Sometimes it happens while walking through a crowd. She lightly guides you by the arm. None of these gestures scream attraction, but together they create a pattern, and patterns are where the real signals live. Let me share a small story that illustrates this perfectly. A man once told me about a conversation he had at a friend's birthday gathering. He had just met a woman, and they started talking casually. They joked about music, they shared stories about travel. The conversation flowed easily. At one point, she reached out and brushed something invisible off his sleeve. He thought nothing of it. A few minutes later, she touched his arm while laughing. Later, it happened again when she was emphasizing a point during the conversation. Each moment lasted only a second, so he ignored it. Months later, they happened to meet again through mutual friends. During a conversation about that first night, she said something that surprised him. She said, "I kept touching your arm because I was trying to see if you felt the connection too." He had missed every signal, and this happens far more than people realize, because most men are trained to notice loud signals, but attraction, especially in its early stages, is often quiet. There's actually a psychological explanation for this. Research on interpersonal attraction shows that when people feel drawn towards someone, their bodies naturally seek ways to reduce physical distance. They lean slightly closer. They orient their body toward the person they're interested in. And yes, they initiate small touches. These behaviors are rarely calculated. They happen instinctively when the brain begins releasing certain chemicals associated with bonding and emotional connection. One of those chemicals is oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. Physical touch can stimulate its release and increase feelings of trust and emotional warmth. So when a woman lightly touches your arm during conversation, she may not even consciously realize why she's doing it. Her body simply feels comfortable, and comfort is often the first doorway through which attraction enters. Now, here's an important detail to remember. One isolated gesture doesn't necessarily mean attraction. People touch each other casually in many social situations, but repeated gestures, especially during a single conversation, often tell a different story. When a woman consistently finds small reasons to touch you, it usually means she feels relaxed in your presence and curious about the connection forming between you. And curiosity is where attraction often begins. Now, let's move into the second signal, because this one reveals something even more powerful. It lives in a place that communicates emotion long before words ever do. The eyes. The second signal appears in a place that reveals emotion long before words ever do. The eyes. You've probably heard the phrase that the eyes are the window to the soul. It may sound poetic, but psychology shows there is real truth behind it. Human beings communicate an enormous amount of emotional information through eye contact. Interest, curiosity, discomfort, trust, and attraction often appear in the eyes before they appear anywhere else. When a woman begins to feel drawn towards someone, something subtle changes in the way she looks at him. It's not simply that she looks at him more often, it's the quality of the gaze. Many men imagine attraction as constant staring, but in reality it usually looks more like a rhythm. She looks at you, she holds your gaze for a moment longer than expected, then she glances down or away. A few seconds pass, then she looks back again. That small cycle, look, soften, glance away, return, is one of the quietest signals that attraction may be beginning. And what makes this fascinating is that most of it happens automatically. When someone feels genuine interest, the body reacts in ways that are very difficult to control consciously. One of those reactions involves the pupils of the eyes. Research in social psychology has shown that when we look at something or someone we find attractive, our pupils naturally dilate. It's an involuntary response controlled by the nervous system. In simple terms, the brain recognizes something it likes, and the body opens up slightly in response. Of course, this doesn't mean you should stare into someone's eyes trying to measure their pupils. That's not the point. The real signal is the feeling behind the gaze. When a woman feels comfortable and intrigued by you, her eyes often soften. Her attention becomes more present. Instead of quick, polite eye contact, the kind people use in everyday interactions, her gaze lingers slightly longer. There's warmth behind it. Let me describe a situation many people have experienced without realizing its significance. You're sitting across from a woman during a conversation. Maybe you're sharing a story. Maybe you're talking about something meaningful. As you speak, she looks at you with a gentle focus. She smiles slightly. Then, almost shyly, she glances downward. A moment passes. Then she looks back at you again. And that pattern repeats throughout the conversation. It feels comfortable, natural, almost magnetic. What you are witnessing in moments like that is the quiet language of attention. Nonverbal communication researchers have studied these patterns for decades. When someone feels genuine interest in another person, their attention naturally becomes more focused. They listen more closely. They respond more emotionally. They remember small details. In other words, their presence becomes deeper. And presence is a powerful signal, because attention is one of the most valuable things a person can offer. When a woman looks at you in that way, she is communicating something without saying a single word. She is saying, "You have my attention." And attention is often the beginning of attraction. Here's another small detail many people overlook. When a woman feels drawn towards someone, she often subtly turns her body toward him as well. Even in a group conversation, imagine you are sitting at a table with several people talking and laughing. Conversations move in different directions, voices overlap, and the atmosphere is relaxed. But every time you speak, one person shifts slightly toward you. Her shoulders angle in your direction. Her gaze returns to you again and again, even when others are talking. That small shift in body orientation reveals something interesting. Her focus is not on the group. Her focus is on you. A man once described an evening like this during a casual dinner with friends. There were 8 people around the table. The conversation moved constantly. Stories, jokes, different topics. But every time he spoke, he noticed the same thing. A woman across from him would turn slightly toward him. Her eyes would meet his. She would smile, then glance downward briefly before meeting his gaze again. He later said something that stayed with me. He said, "The room was full of people, but somehow it felt like the conversation between us had its own little space." That feeling is something many people recognize once they start paying attention to it. When someone gives you focused attention in a crowded environment, it creates a subtle bubble around the interaction. The outside world fades slightly. The moment feels more personal. And those moments are rarely accidental. Now, here's a simple exercise you can try the next time you're in a social setting. Instead of focusing only on what you're saying, start observing how people respond. Notice who maintains eye contact longer than usual. Notice who glances back at you across the room more than once. Notice who seems especially attentive when you speak. Human beings communicate constantly through these small signals, and once you begin noticing them, social interactions become much easier to understand. Now we come to the third signal, and this one is the most powerful of all. Because while touch and eye contact can sometimes happen casually in many situations, this third signal almost always requires intention. It involves something that most men completely overlook, a shift in space. And when you start recognizing it, you'll begin to see it everywhere. Because when a woman begins to feel genuine attraction, she often does something very specific. She creates privacy where there wasn't any before.
The third signal appears in something most people rarely think about: space. Not the words being said, not even the gestures, but the way space between two people quietly changes. When a woman begins to feel genuine attraction, she often starts creating small moments of privacy where none existed before. These moments are rarely dramatic. They don't look like scenes from movies where someone pulls you into another room. Instead, they appear as small shifts within ordinary social situations. Imagine you're standing in a group conversation at a gathering. Everyone is chatting casually, the atmosphere is relaxed. Suddenly, she turns slightly toward you and says something like, "Hey, come here for a second, I want to show you something." Maybe she points out something across the room. Maybe she suggests grabbing a drink together at the bar. Maybe she lowers her voice slightly and shares a quiet comment meant only for you. On the surface, these actions seem simple, but psychologically, they carry meaning. When someone feels drawn to another person, they often begin creating what researchers sometimes describe as microenvironments, small spaces where two people can interact more personally without the attention of a larger group. These spaces allow curiosity and connection to grow naturally. For many women, emotional comfort plays a very important role in attraction. Creating a brief pocket of privacy allows her to observe you more closely. She can see how you respond when the interaction becomes slightly more personal. Do you stay relaxed? Do you maintain eye contact? Do you respond with warmth and presence? Or do you suddenly become nervous and rush the moment? These quiet shifts in space often act like gentle invitations, not tests in the competitive sense people sometimes imagine, more like subtle opportunities, a way of saying, without saying it directly, let's see what happens if we talk a little more closely. Let me share a small story that illustrates this perfectly. A man once described attending a friend's engagement party. There were around 30 people in the room. Music playing softly, laughter, conversations happening everywhere. During the evening, he spoke several times with a woman he had just met. Nothing dramatic, just casual conversation and a few shared jokes. Then at one point, she leaned toward him and said, "Hey, come look at this photo album my friend brought from her trip." The album was sitting on a small table across the room. It wasn't particularly interesting, just travel photos. But something important happened in that moment. When they stepped away from the group and stood together by the table, the entire atmosphere shifted. The conversation became quieter, more relaxed, more personal. They talked there for almost 20 minutes. Later, he realized something interesting. The photo album had never really been the point. The moment was. She had simply created a small opportunity for a private interaction. And situations like this happen constantly in everyday life. Sometimes it's suggesting a short walk outside. Sometimes it's asking your opinion about something away from the group. Sometimes it's leaning slightly closer and lowering her voice when speaking.
Each of these actions quietly reduces the distance between two people. And when attraction is present, distance tends to shrink gradually over time. Here is the key point many people miss. When a woman creates one of these moments of privacy, she is often paying close attention to how you respond, not to judge you, but to see whether you recognize the moment. Do you become more attentive? Do you stay present and relaxed? Or do you overthink the situation and rush the interaction forward? Attraction grows best in calm moments. One of the most attractive qualities a person can show is simple presence, the ability to enjoy the moment without forcing anything to happen. That's why awareness matters so much. When you recognize these signals, touch, eye contact, and the creation of small private moments, something powerful happens. You stop feeling like you're guessing. You stop trying to manufacture attraction out of nothing. Instead, you simply notice when interest is already there, and then you respond naturally. You stay present, you stay relaxed, you allow the interaction to unfold. And that's where the real magic of human connection begins. Because confidence in relationships rarely comes from saying the perfect line. It comes from awareness, from understanding what is already happening between two people. When you see those quiet signals clearly, you no longer feel uncertain about whether a moment matters. You recognize when curiosity is growing. You notice when attention lingers. You feel when two people are becoming slightly more aware of each other than they are of everyone else around them. And once you begin noticing those whispers of connection, social interactions become much easier to navigate. Let me leave you with one final thought. Attraction is not something you chase. It's something you recognize. It begins quietly, with a touch that lingers a second longer, with a returning gaze across the room, with a small moment of privacy created just for two people. These signals are not loud, they are not dramatic, but they are meaningful. And the next time you experience a moment like that, pause for a second and simply observe, because sometimes the most important things people communicate are the ones they never say out loud. And now, you know how to hear them.